know Margot from her time at Wits. She's currently a lecturer at the School of Geography and Planning at the University of Cardiff, lecturer in spatial planning. We did send your mini bio around so people can quickly see all the other wonderful things that you've been involved in. And I was over the years, I think you and I have had some quite robust conversations about gender. And actually, I want you to create a robust conversation, which I'm sure you will do. It's your thing. But I'm going to hand over to you. I'm very interested in the implications of gender in our work and in public space and things we need to be thinking about. So thank you, Margot. Over to you. Have you got the screen? Are you sharing?
Right, let me share right now. Right, can everyone see the screen?
Yes, I don't think it's in presentation mode, but maybe that's coming along. It's a long way to Cardiff. There we go. Thanks.
Okay, super. Great, thank you everybody, and really appreciate the opportunity to chat to you. I've been aware of the work that you've been doing for quite a long time, and I'm very interested in it. But today I'm going to be talking a bit about gender, intersectionality and space, and thinking through what we call difference and the everyday experience of difference in public spaces, in all kinds of different spaces. And the presentation that I'm going to give has got two parts to it. And the first part is going to be just a general sense of the context around gender and the urban and South Africa. And the second part will be very much based on a series of studies that I've been involved in one way or another, and what they tell us about this question of gender and the urban and public space and all kinds of other things. So let me just get on with it. Just to start with, when we talk about gender, you know, there are a whole bunch of different theories about what it means, and I won't go into that. I'm not sure that it's of much interest to anybody right now. But really, where we're coming from on this, and where I'm coming from on this, is to say that we can't just think about gender as what is considered male and what is considered female, what is considered non-binary. When we think about gender, we have to think about it in what's called an intersectional way. We have to think about it in terms of what are the other things that make up a person's identity, their race, their socioeconomic conditions, their religion, caste, disability, sexuality, all kinds of different things. And the reason for that is because it very much influences how people are able to navigate and how able to live in cities on a daily basis. And so the experience of myself as a middle-class, fairly well-educated white woman walking through the city of Joburg is, of course, quite different to somebody who is disabled, who is of a, you know, doesn't have quite the same socioeconomic advantages that I have, all of those kinds of things. And so when we're starting to think about this, what I want you to keep in mind, just generally during this conversation, is that the complexity of talking about the idea of gender and the idea of the fact that different people's identity creates different sets of needs and different ideas of what's needed. Okay, so let's move on. So, why my pictures aren't coming up? Let's just have a look. Okay, there we go. So where are we? Well, I mean, in South Africa, we have more or less parity around male-female, unlike some other societies. But what is interesting is the differences that we do see between men and women. So women are more likely to collect fuel, more likely to collect water than men, and generally young women, in the case, they're more likely to engage in care activities. Interestingly, though, 11% of Black women had no schooling, with 14% of men. Women, on the other hand, spend between 198 and 266 minutes per day on unpaid work. Men spend about 84 to 105, and you can really see that there's a huge disparity between that. And what was interesting for me is that when we did various case studies and various research, it doesn't change that much in different socioeconomic groups and different racial groups. We'll talk a bit about that later. Sorry, I don't know why my phone's going off. 4 out of every 10 children between the ages of 0 and 7 live only with their mother in South Africa at the moment, which is quite a large percentage if you think about it. And why are we thinking about this within the urban context? Well, 64.1 or 65% of the population, 2/3 of the population, live in urban areas, and this number is only going to go up. We're seeing huge growth in the major cities, less growth in the smaller cities, but still, on average, what we're doing and what we're seeing is a move toward an urban population, and that's really what's going on. So we're having this huge move toward a young urban population, and this is important because this is also the population that is, of course, kind of reproductive and having children and looking after children and looking after young people. We also know, for example, that in terms of productive work or household production, women do far more in terms of household production than men. And what we also see is that to a large degree, women are, and females are engaged in what are considered non-market activities, so activities that are not necessarily generating money, for example. And we also see that there is a much higher unemployment rate for women in formal and informal sectors in urban areas than for men. Female literacy is lower on average, and this is where things start to get interesting. And when we talk about gender, of course, we're also talking about men and their relationship to public space. Men are most likely to be the victims of crime, especially violent crime, and especially young Black men. On average, they are the ones who experience and are the victims of the vast majority of violent crime in South Africa. And what we're also seeing is that new household formation is demonstrating high rates of single male households. So we're seeing young men splitting off from their families and creating single households, which is a relatively new phenomenon. We haven't seen that much of it before. And we're seeing this in a whole lot of different ways. Migrant populations, both cross-border migrants and internal migrants, creating this kind of effect. And then the GCR a few years ago did this really interesting study around quality of life. And what they did is they looked at the relationship between quality of life and having children. And I mean, this is quite an interesting graph, but basically what it says is that your quality of life when having children in a household with two parents in it is actually quite high. But if it is a single parent household, whereas a female head, it's much lower. If it's a male head, it's low, it's not as low. So being a single female parent is basically ensures that your quality of life is lower than almost any other category of person in South Africa. And that's quite interesting. So talk a bit more about that. So the other thing that we need to be aware of, and these are just some general points that I'm sure you are aware of, is that well, there's a highly differentiated experience of gender in the city between men and women. The way that men and women navigate the city, the way that they're able to navigate the city, the way that they have to perform their gender, all these different things change depending on where you live, who you are as you move through the city. And in terms of urban infrastructure, studies consistently show that women, the poor, racial minorities, marginalized, have the worst access to critical infrastructure: water, electricity, housing, all of the rest of it, as one would imagine. And then, in terms of what you might be interested in, there's a really a lot of evidence to show that urban public spaces are not doing what they should for women at this point. They're still considered unsafe. They're still considered difficult to navigate, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And what's also something that we need to keep in mind when thinking about men and women, how they navigate space, is the use of transit and mobility. So what we see is that South African females and South African women, on average, use public transport more than men. They're the least likely to own a private vehicle. They're least likely to have a driver's license. But we have seen growth in that. But they're also the most likely to make what's called trip chaining. So you're going on a trip and going from work, picking up the kids, getting the shopping done, visiting a relative, dropping something off. So this idea of doing multiple things along the way, when one is actually transiting, moving through the city, is more common with women than with men. And what we see with men is that they tend to have a much simpler set of kind of mobility practices, where what they tend to do is get up, drop kids off at school if they do that, and then go to work, come home, that's it. That's generally all they move around the city for their jobs. But they don't have the same level of complexity in their daily trips and in their daily movement as women. And we see this right across the board and in all kinds of cultures, in all kinds socioeconomic groups, and quite frankly, in all kinds of countries. And that's really interesting, because that is something that we need to consider when thinking about how we arrange space and how we arrange transport and how we think about the kinds of infrastructure that supports these activities. Okay, so now that's the general picture. That's kind of stuff that we can garner from work that's been done, from literature, from census data, from all kinds of different information. But okay, here I'm going to take you into work that I've been involved in one way or another. So since about 2016, when Philip Harrison, who was my boss at the time, said, "Oh, Margot, we've got the study. It was started by Yasmin Dinat, and she's moved out of research. She's moved into the public sector. Can you take this on?" So in 2016, my colleague Alex Park and I started doing work on gender. And the first project we did was called Mothers in the City in 2016. And that was really interesting. We started understanding how women who care for children, mothers in the general sense, move around, navigate the city, the challenges that they find. But we kept coming up against this really weird thing where we kept saying, "Oh, okay, this is what women do. Is it the same or different to how men behave, or how men's relationship to the city?" So then we did the next study, which was called Families in the City. And Families in the City was really interesting, because then we were able to look at men and women within the same household and understand their childcare activities, their relationship to space, how they were moving around, and really to kind of get a really deep sense of the challenges that men and women were facing when moving around a city like Gauteng, an area like Gauteng, Witwatersrand and Gauteng largely. And then we started looking at this in a slightly different way. We started looking at micro scale and macro infrastructure. And here the argument that we were making was that the state invests enormous amounts, so does the private sector, in these huge macro infrastructure projects, the BRT, the Caltrain, all kinds of things. But they don't seem to be used by the vast majority of people in these cities. What's going on? And so we started looking into household decision making. We started looking into questions of age and questions of socioeconomics, and trying to understand what's used, how, and why. And we did that both in Gauteng and in Maputo. And then we were part of another project called Youth Futures, which looked at the nexus between work and housing in Ekangala, just north of Pretoria, Botswana, and in Hawassa in Ethiopia. And so we were trying to understand there, once again, how people move around, and also the relationship of age to gender and to work and to housing. So I've come at this from a number of different angles, and I'm going to be drawing material from all of these different studies to kind of give you a sense of some of the issues that people are facing, and some of the challenges and some of the concerns that face both men and women when moving around the city. All right, I have a quick break for something to drink. Hope you'll know I'm doing this without my first cup of coffee. So, okay. So when we started thinking about questions of gender, one of the key questions we thought about was this issue of parenting, and ask people, what are the kind of concerns, what are the difficulties of parenting in a city like Johannesburg and a place like Gauteng? And lots of people said things like, it's really hard to push a pram. The pavements are in terrible condition. You can't push a pram down a road. And in my experience, this is completely true. There are no facilities to change children. Very often you'll end up changing children, who are nappies and whatever else, in cars, on the floor of toilets. And one place where I really got incredibly irritated, because it advertised itself as being a child-friendly space. They didn't have any change rooms, changing tables in the bathrooms. So I decided to change my child on one of their tables in the restaurant. I didn't know it was not popular for that, but anyway, I was incredibly annoyed. And there are lots of places where basically it's just unsafe in one way or another for children to go into public space. Roads are very dangerous, drivers are dangerous, and in many places, parks are not safe places for mothers and children. And so you get this whole plethora of situations where it's hard for parents, and it's hard for people who are looking after children, and one way or another, to be able to navigate these spaces. And that's made even more difficult by the fact that it's very hard to afford good childcare for people. It's for the vast majority of people are forced to leave children with relatives, either at home in the rural areas, or back in the cities with relatives who they may not trust. Childcare is often not regulated. Domestic workers are often not trained properly. And so what we start to see is that there's this very difficult situation where parents are left in a situation where they have to make hard choices about earning a living versus childcare, leaving their children in basically quite dangerous situations, or potentially dangerous situations, abusive situations, or being able to go to work. And that's something that a lot of people face all the time. So you can see that that's really, really a difficult choice to be making. So things like transit and mobility. Here we started looking at you know, things about like how easy or difficult it is for people in general, men and women, to navigate these different spaces. And what we found is that for the vast majority of people who use paratransit, who use taxis, taxi ranks are just not pleasant spaces. They are not great in many, many different ways. They're often they often have very few facilities. People sit in situations where they queue for a long time, where they may to wait for a long time in taxis until taxis are full. There are often no places to sit. There are often no toilet facilities. If there are toilet facilities, they're not well maintained. They're considered quite dangerous. And so people stand, sit and wait in the rain and in the sun, basically to be able to get there, to be able to go anywhere. And of course, we know of the situations that have happened a few years ago where young women were molested. And what we did find is that both men and women are in situations of potential violence from taxi drivers and from queue marshals who object anytime people speak up about the dangers, anytime they speak up about poor driving, anytime people speak up about any kind of abuse. And so what we see is this a very uncomfortable situation around transit and around mobility for the vast majority of people who are basically trying to navigate our cities on a daily basis. And then we also have to think about this kind of intersectionality. So there are certain issues that go around being a younger woman and how you dress and how you have to perform your gender. But there are also issues around age, for example, older people trying to navigate their way through the town. So in thinking about older women in particular, lots of concerns about safety, lots of concerns about literally just being able to move through the city, to carry things. And when you have a situation where you have high dependency ratios of young children on grandparents, it starts to become a really difficult thing that we need to consider, this idea of what's happening with young people and the elderly and how they're able to navigate the city. Okay. So the next piece comes from some work we did in Lenasia, and in Edenvale, and in Bertram's, and a couple of other places. And here what became really interesting was how entrenched the apartheid geography is around in the city, and how difficult transit options are for both men and women when trying to basically engage in their activities on a daily basis. This was very much a mobility kind of study. And people in Lenasia and various other places talk about how hard it is, how far away they are. They talk about being far away from civilization. And then also in places like informal settlements, in places like old industrial areas which have been converted into residential areas, what we see is there are very few amenities, very little transport. And so we see people who are involved in childcare, once again, people who are involved in cities and trying to move through it, having to walk for long periods of time. So this is a particular case from a mother who was living in Denver, and she's the mother of 3 disabled children. And she has to take her children to the Charlotte Lake Hospital. And she says, we use taxis, and when we do not have taxi fare, we walk. During summer, we leave exactly at 5 a.m. and past 5 a.m. during winter. We cross George Koch Hostel, and we get there at 9 or 10 a.m. So we're talking about the fact that a mother with 3 small children, generally her mother, the grandmother, walk for 4 or 5 hours in each direction to be able to access facilities and amenities for their children. That's what we're talking about in terms of some of the gender and some of the location and footprint of the city that persists. And as a consequence of these kinds of difficulties that go on, as a consequence of danger, as a consequence of discomfort, what we see is what we've seen from our studies is that women in general, and it seems to be the case very often, try and make their worlds as small as they possibly can. And this map on the right is a map done by in conjunction with GCRO on one of our reports. And basically what it shows is how women tend to cluster their activities, work, their kids' school, where they go shopping, all the activities in as small a space as they possibly can to try and mitigate against the difficulties that the city offers. And also because of their multiple responsibilities, their reproductive, productive, and kind of community responsibilities, they tend to have to try and figure out how to navigate these spaces and all of these different activities at the same time. So we see the same situation for both for poor mothers and for more wealthier mothers. This is a case from Edenvale. And if you look at the top, there's this kind of interesting pattern that goes on with the male partner, and he's all over the city, and he's driving here, there, and everywhere. And the female partner, it's very much the same pattern, day after day after day. And so we see this, women's behavior, women's lives are constrained. They seem to have, so they cover smaller distances, their patterns vary less in terms of transport, and so their lives and their transit patterns are smaller and more repetitive than men. And this was actually a kind of a mental map that one of our mothers did. And you can see Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, ditto, 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 same thing day after day after day. It kind of gives us a sense of that. So what are we beginning to think about? Well, what do these things tell us? We can see, for example, that within the cities themselves, pre-existing geographies of the cities influence mobility and choice for all kinds of people. Areas and their distance and design as dormitory towns are still very much in evidence. Older apartheid white suburbs still provide some of the best amenities, and informal settlements still lack quite a lot of the amenities. We know all this. And we see that history shapes how people move through the city, but our research also shows that this is gendered, and this is also about intersectionality and how different people, different groups are able to move and how they're not able to move. We see that women's work is still generally part-time and contingent on men's work, and this is a big issue when we're trying to make cities productive and when we're trying to make them safe for everybody. We see that women's spatial footprints are often smaller than men's, and women still tend to orbit the domestic realm. This hasn't changed significantly. Okay, we still see that a lot of women, in fact, the vast majority of women are still very much involved in childcare, and men do what we call parenthetical parenting, where they're involved in the mornings and in the evenings and everything that happens in between responsibilities. And that has implications for how we think about space and how we think about what's going on. Okay. So what are some of our conclusions? This can be a hostile place for those trying to take care, be responsible for children, as well as other members of the community. And I should have said that because that tends to be a very gendered role. It's generally considered unsafe, inhospitable, and difficult to navigate. As a result, women tend to stay close to home, and what this does is it entrenches and reinforces notions of femininity and domesticity. It constrains economic opportunity, and it just allows for basically people reaching their full potential. There is a lack of publicly funded and public spaces that are safe for mothers and children and safe for people in general, and there's generally a lack of implemented regulation around childcare. Women are left with tough choices around parenting in both private and public spaces. So what do we need to do? Well, let's start thinking intersectionally. Let's start thinking about not just men, women, etc. needs are all the same, but thinking about what are the components of the population? How do we start to play in for and think about young men and the violence that they face, young women and some of the dangers that they face, people with parents and how they're moving around the city, people with different kinds of needs and how they move. So we need to think about cheap and well-regulated care facilities, cheaper, better transport, better pedestrian facilities. And if we're not sure what else we need to do, then let's ask, because that's always the best way. Ask people what they need and then try and assist them. So that's me for the moment. I hope I was as controversial as Anne hoped me to be. And that's my email address if you want to get hold of me. So thank you very much.
Rubin, Margot, I just love it. So now what I also find interesting is we know this stuff and you put it in our face. I don't want to be, you know what I mean? So people live with this fact, but they don't until you put it in their face think, oh shit, now what does that mean for us? So now have we got some questions here for Margot? I do hope so. Or some ideas or some thoughts about what we need to be thinking about. Don't tell me there's not one hand. Oh, jolly good. Yeah, hello.
Hi, Margot. Thank
you.
you.
How are you?
I just want to explore a different way of maybe understanding the limited range of what I would call highly poverty-stricken people. Because if one looks at the South African cities, the distances, the cost, I'm just wondering that the economic realities are not the reason why people have such limited use and exposure to their cities. Yes, you've got the example of walking 5 hours to a hospital. I mean, it's outrageous what people have to do. But I'm just saying, I don't know if this is necessarily a gender issue or a deprivation issue. And they are linked because women are generally more disadvantaged than males. But I'm just seeing this as another way of looking at it. And when you say people are very limited, you know, this is the latest urban design studies, is the 15-minute city. I mean, you know, get everything in your area. So there's something about, yes, bringing facilities to them, which is critical, and understanding the difference of women and the difference of LGBT. I mean, these things, gender and LGBT, is huge in this country and elsewhere. People need safe spaces. So it's more comment. I'm not asking for answers. I'm just responding to your very interesting talk. So thank you.
Thanks, Yael. And I mean, you know, I think we do have to consider all of these things. I think we have to think about deprivation, and then, as you rightly pointed to, how the issues of gender and how issues of sexuality and how issues of identity map onto deprivation, and how that affects how people navigate and move around the city. I completely agree with that. But what's interesting to me is that a lot of these things actually worked right across socioeconomic lines. And, you know, a lot of these kind of gendered activities within households were exactly the same in very middle class families as they were in lower income families. And that's interesting to me. And it's something to my mind, worth exploring. Yeah. So yeah, thanks. That's very helpful.
So I see Carolyn's come in here. Carolyn.
It's more of a statement. So operating as a woman or in fact as any gender in the public environment is extremely tricky, particularly in Johannesburg. And I'd like to make a comment more about what the council and how the council plans or does not plan for this. So if you read the IDP or the SDF or even the bylaws, the council at no time takes responsibility as the largest landowner in the city, being the owner of all the city streets, parks and things like that. They are the largest single landowner. They take no responsibility and have no vision for it. Nowhere in any of these documents it says, we want streets that look like this, and the roads agency, Department of Transport, water department, you know, all of these people, this is what, when you build in these roads, in these spaces, these are the parameters, the design parameters that you need to include. So I just want to raise that as like a huge issue that I think contributes to the findings of what Margot has just been speaking about. And Margot is 100%. I, as a single mom, forever, I can tell you that my world is extremely, extremely tight. My house, my work, my children's schools are all within 5 kilometers of each other. And otherwise I could not operate. So yes, exactly. 100% support what you say. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Carolyn. I mean, I think that's such an interesting point that you raised about the lack of kind of sensitivity in some of the planning around gender and around kind of, you know, kind of thinking about parameters. Yeah, it's not for lack of trying. I mean, you know, we work with all the we work with a lot of planners in the city of Joburg. I mean, I was involved in teaching a lot of them, and so it's not a lack of awareness, but we still can't seem to kind of get traction on this. So it's a really interesting question for me. But thank you. Yeah. That's really insightful.
It is. I want to come back to that. So Wayne, I was hoping you'd add in here, because I think it has an awful lot of food for thought for Josie My Josie, as well as the work that we do.
And absolutely, Margot, thank you very much for the presentation. It absolutely shines a bright light in terms of the challenges that our women folk face in the city. Yes, I can confirm that it's difficult to push a pram. It's difficult to survive as a single woman in the city. When you see a mom with a baby on her back, and then she got her groceries on her head, and she's carrying another bag, and you ask yourself the question, who is going to help? Now, what we need to realize and first appreciate, this city was not built on future prospects. These roads were laid donkey years ago, and the city just grew and grew and grew and grew. And there was no further plans in terms of how the city has to change with the people, with the risks, with the speed of movement. And you absolutely, the previous speaker is absolutely right. Caroline is absolutely right. The city needs to have solid future leaders. The problem that we're sitting with here is because it's a political environment, there's a 5-year plan. Whether our plans fit into that political party's plans to push it through really doesn't matter. So they'll throw money at their political might just to win some. Now, that's the problem with safety and security. Safety and security should never, ever be political. Services, especially critical services, should never, ever be linked to politics, because this is where we find ourselves now, where we have no electricity, no water, no proper traffic management, no bylaw management. But there is a positive change now. They have now seen that bylaw management is the biggest cause of our crime and safety problems in the city. So the LETT teams are working on that, and they're doing a phenomenal job. But they need to be supported from the highest levels, not just in government, but also supported by us, who are the worker bees, who are the people on the ground trying to make that change, to work hand in glove with them. But it needs to be a drive. This forum here and all the other forums needs to hold them accountable. This 5-year thing of this is what we're going to be doing the next 100 days, we need to stop that. We need to start saying, if you do not bring us to the table when you are elected and start listening to us in terms of what we need, not what you think we need. It's about having that come to Jesus conversation with the powers that be. This is what leadership is about. But well done. Thank you very much.
Margot, do you want to put a comment in there, or you just so lovely? We've got, 33, 35 totally passionate people. It's just, I love it. Do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, what's are really interesting things for me, and I'm totally fascinated by bylaws. I know it sounds like an odd preoccupation, but there you go. Because in a number of cases, bylaws have worked really badly against women. They've been really prejudicial, particularly women who are involved in home-based enterprises, particularly women who are involved in survivalist activities, kind of hawking on the street and so on and so forth. And so I have this very ambivalent kind of response to bylaw enforcement. So on the one hand, I completely understand that it's very much about kind of the broken window kind of thinking. It's very much about making sure that cities work. But on the other hand, I can't help but worry a little bit about them. So yeah, so thank you, Dwayne. Wayne, sorry, and something that I'd love to chat more about and really, really think about. I think your general message about support and about, kind of getting into this is absolutely spot on.
So before I make a comment or two, and I love, you just keep asking questions. To a degree, it's your job, but it's just wonderful. I love it. Anybody else got a comment to put in here before I say something? Margot, I've loved this. I think everybody is making some really interesting points here. And part of our work is so everybody's so deep in the forest here, trying to deal with the basics, that we don't always think about everything else around it. And to me, in an ideal world, we would be thinking about space. I think many people would judge their success of their work by the number of elderly women, children using the space, enjoying the space, feeling free in the space, able to use it as they want. And in many cases, we don't think about that so specifically. We just think, golly gosh, we've just got to catch the people and fix it. You know what I mean? So I'm loving this, and when we get a chance, and I'm sure everybody's work is going to think about much bigger things than we're inclined. I don't mean this rudely, because everybody's just doing an amazing job, but when you're dealing with the everyday things, it's sometimes difficult to think about the bigger picture. And I think what's nice is Carolyn said it, and so several other women have said it. Actually, this is very true about my life. I mean, I've got white hair and I'm a little slower than I was. And therefore, I might think about walking in Delta during the week on my own and wait until it's full and things are happening. So it's us, actually. How do you want your space to be, and how do we want to work in that space? So I've loved this. Now, Michaela's coming in and she'll have a great point here, I'm sure. Michaela?
Thanks, Anne. I think that that's very much, the point of the conversation is saying, what are the questions? And I think as women, we generally are perceiving, we go into a space with that in the back of our head. Can I walk here with my child? Can I go to the bathroom? Is there light? Is there an exit point? And I think the reality of being a woman in our lives is that we perceive space differently. And I think part of that is saying, kind of, what are the fundamental questions that we can have as a pack to say, you're going into a planning meeting, you're going into a meeting where you're having these conversations, ask these 5 questions. Ask these 5 questions of the men who are designing the space, because it's still, the built environment and space is still very masculine. It's still the nature of the space. And say, how would your mother use this space? How would your sister use this space? How would your wife and your children utilize the space in a way? Would they be comfortable? And I know it. My husband won't let me go into certain places. I'm not allowed to drive on certain roads if I'm going to meetings, because he freaks out about it. And it's the reality of the space that we're in. And I think it's something that some of us are more conscious of than others. And it's also the reality of far more complex than just gender, social normities of South Africa. I'm a white woman in this space, or I'm a black woman in this space. What are the differences of that environment? And I think that Margot brought a very relevant point up about the informal sector within our spaces as well, and understanding how should our bylaws be treating and engaging. And when we're talking about enforcement, what should that look like in the context of understanding the individuality of those people and the context in which they're, and we see it particularly with the traders, because that is predominantly, a female occupation in the city. And we need to understand the dynamics of that. And when we're saying enforcement, what then does that mean? And I think we've seen it in a number of our districts. Those women are incredible. They're our block leaders. They're our resources. They're our eyes. They're the first ones to, point someone out doing something that they shouldn't be. And we need to recognize them as that pillar and that strength and that opportunity. And we need to be designing our enforcement around that and around what they're able to bring to the table as well, which I think is really critical.
So now here we see, now we get it going just when we need to cut off. Letitia, come on in.
Sorry, I can't turn. I think I can turn on. I'm not sure. Let's see. Oh, yes, there I am. Okay. I just wanted to mention a word that we used in property development or precinct development. Is we used to do, after designing a precinct, before implementing it, what we used to do is called a contact journey. So every person in the team pretends to be, one would be pretending to be a mother with a toddler that needs to go to the bathroom and a grocery trolley, and, you know, and another would pretend to be a businessman on the way to a meeting, walking from the car to the venue, carrying a laptop and a mobile phone. And if you do this, then suddenly a lot of design issues can be addressed because you really experience it as though you were that person. But I know that's for designing new precincts, but I don't think there's an issue for implementing that with existing precincts too.
What a good point. I love it. Margot, do you want to give us a closing something? And then I see you've put your contact details there, so I'm sure people can get hold of you. And do you mind if we share this presentation?
No, I'd absolutely love that. I'm so pleased that it could be useful to you. So that's great. I'll send that through to you, Anne, if you want just to distribute it or however, whatever works for you. Yeah, I think just to go back, you know, you said it so well earlier. You said we're not unaware of these issues, and I think that's key to it. Nothing I said is new or mine. Like, no, we all know this. This is not news. But I think what's interesting is we still aren't great at implementing and at putting it into practice, and that's hard. I mean, it's hard because, as Michaela pointed out, and you know, institutionally, environments are still very male dominated. The vast majority of transport planners are still men. The vast majority of people who are involved in the built environment are still men. And there's no prejudice against men. I think, you know, some of my best friends are men. But it's just along the lines of we just need to do exactly what Letitia was saying. Think about the other. Think about different kinds of uses, different kinds of people. And I think we're well on the way for doing that. It's just going to be more. And if I can help and if I can support in any way, please call on me. I'm always happy to try and do it. I mean, I am an academic, but don't hold that against me. I'm sure I can help in other ways.
And I'm practical. Don't hold it against me. So actually, it's just wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for, I know the timing didn't suit you very well. Very appreciative. Thank you. And thank you for stimulating our thought process. We're very grateful. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Anne. And thanks for inviting me. Take care.
Happy day.